If you ache for truth, goodness, and beauty, if you're hungry for a Christianity with substance and strength, if you long for a faith that's big and bold and biblical and all about Jesus Christ, if you're inspired by the idea of one church that has spanned 20 centuries, 24 time zones, and 2 hemispheres, enfolding every race, nation, and language, then you're considering Catholicism. So this is going to be the final part of this little mini-series on Catholic moral theology. How do we understand what is or isn't moral and the categories of moral theology? But today, I want to put those tools to work on 4 very ordinary, but I think relatable areas of life. So money lending, truth-telling under pressure, disciplining our children, and gambling. And as I go through these, you'll see exactly how the distinctions that we've been making between intrinsic evil and prudential judgment and authentic development, how they play out in real life, and how they help us think clearly amid the controversies of our day. The goal here is not to give you ready-made answers for every situation, but to show you the schematics and the processes that the Catholic Church has laid out so that you can reason through moral questions with the mind of the Church in your own life and in the questions that matter most to you. In essence, you can have a developed conscience, a conscience that's been shaped and formed by Catholic moral teaching. So let's just kind of march through these examples and see what we can do to make some sense out of them. Let's begin with money lending, specifically the question of charging interest when you loan money. That's something that back in the Middle Ages, ancient times, the church used to call usury. And the unchangeable principle here is justice in economic exchanges. All economic exchanges must be just. So you should never exploit another person's need or their vulnerability or their desperation for your own unearned gain. That flows straight out of the commandments against theft and covetousness, and from the dignity of both the borrower and lender as persons made in the image of God when you exploit another person's need or vulnerability or desperation. So the principle is universal and unchanging. It's rooted in the natural law and the gospel call to love our neighbor as ourselves. So then, when is money lending intrinsically evil? Well, the church teaches when the loan is structured so that the object of the will is to profit from the borrower's desperation without taking any real risk or contributing anything productive to the exchange. In that case, the object would be intrinsically disordered. It lacks the due justice that ought to be present in any kind of business exchange. You see, the act of lending something is good in its being ontologically. But in the case of exploiting someone, that lending is deprived of moral goodness. So the evil is a privation in the moral order. The act of lending in that case lacks the due ordering to the common good that it should have. And really, this is the same logic that we saw in the first episode with the bent nature of evil, right? Good faculties turned toward a disordered end. So to make this concrete, picture what usury, this kind of unethical money lending, looked like way back in the ancient world or the medieval world when the church was condemning it. So let's suppose you have a desperate peasant farmer and, his family is starving and whatnot. He needs seed to plant in the spring. And in that economy, money was seen as sterile. It didn't generate new wealth on its own like land or tools did. If you had land or tools, right, they could produce something. Money, especially coins sitting in a chest in a castle, didn't multiply. They didn't have markets. They didn't have interest. Okay, there weren't ETFs and exchanges and the Standard & Poor's. Money was just this dead, sterile thing. You had coins that you were hoarding in a chest. Now, the money lender would give the peasant farmer the money, the coins for his seed, but he would demand repayment of twice that amount in 6 months. So he gives you 10 whatever gold coins or whatever the kind of coin it was, and he wants 20 back in 6 months by the end of the season. And he would secure the loan against the farmer's land or against the farmer's harvest, so that even in the case of drought or flood or the farmer dies, the lender could seize everything the farmer and his family had and still come out ahead. So the object of the lender's choice was pure exploitation. The profit came solely out of the borrower's desperate need, not from any genuine risk they shared or positive contribution to sort of leverage the money. That object is bent, it's disordered, it's deprived of the justice that ought to be there. Contrast that with legitimate money lending today. So when a family borrows at a reasonable market rate to buy a home, or when the church herself borrows money to build a new parish hall, or it invests the pension fund for the priests in productive enterprises, that genuinely shares market risk and it contributes to economic growth, and the object is ordered to the common good. So the lender and the borrower both benefit from the productive use of capital. This gets a little bit confusing, so let me give you some contemporary examples that I think still cross the line into unjust money lending. Take payday loan centers. These kind of loan center things, I'm like loan sharking centers that will loan people money against their next paycheck. And they'll charge like triple-digit interest to low-income families that are in crisis. Or credit card companies that charge minimum payment traps to keep people in perpetual debt. Or you take, the loan sharks, the mafia guys who, organized crime. They're going to loan desperate people money today, and by next week, the interest payment, the VIG, is going to keep doubling and doubling and doubling until no one can ever get out of it. And at that point, the lender is just a predator, and a predator who's not trying to leverage capital, and make a fair profit while the borrower, receives some good, like buying a mortgage to buy a house or your car or whatnot. This is a case of really preying on people's desperation and putting them in debt traps and poverty traps. And the privation in the object determines the moral character. You see, the church has always taught the positive obligation that lending should serve the common good and human flourishing. We're called to use our resources to help one another, not to hoard or exploit them. So this positive duty is part of the church's social teaching that calls every baptized person to solidarity. But this is where prudential judgment comes in. Because in a simple agrarian economy where money was just a medium of exchange, just coins in a chest in a castle or something, it didn't produce more money on its own. It didn't sit in funds and be loaned out by, the way that we have banks now, where the banks take money that's deposited and loan them out for cars and homes and whatnot, and the pie grows for everyone. It was an exploitative process whereby sterile coins are given to someone so that you can, take their farm back from them. As economies became more commercial and capital became productive, you had the emergence of legitimate banks in Europe. And Catholics were at the front of that. The Medici banks and some of the banks in Florence and these places that set up means of financial capital and capital exchange and loans so that businesses and trade could grow. Okay, the lender generally shared risk. There was moral legitimacy. Look, good Catholics today can still disagree about specific interest rates. Is 15% too much to charge desperate people on a credit card? Is it 18%, 21%, 30%, right? How much profit should banks and lenders make? What kind of payment terms, right? All of this is an area for prudential discussion. And banking regulations and credit practices, all of those things can be discussed and should be discussed. The important thing is that in all of these exchanges, there is a seeking of the common good and not merely an exploitation of the poor. So prudential judgment would require us to look at the data, analyze it with good financial tools, understand how that data plays out, how the consequences for the vulnerable and the desperate, and the overall impact on society. I think you can clearly look at some aspects of money lending today which become simply debt traps for the poor. And I think those are immoral. I think, though, all of us that have ever bought a car or a home can understand that, or have money in a 401k or IRA or a pension retirement account, can understand there's ways to positively use capital. What I think we see here is authentic development in Catholic teaching. The core principle of justice never changed. What developed over time was a clearer distinction between exploitative usury, which remains always morally inadmissible because the object is intrinsically disordered, and fair, productive lending, which can serve the common good. The church refined the application as economic realities of a money economy, of a capital economy, developed markets and trade and this and that. And that's development done right. So over time, the core principles stayed the same. We had deeper insights. We adapted those core principles to new circumstances. It's not a U-turn. But the privation in the object logic that we talked about in the first episode still remains intact. Lending someone something is good. Lending someone something that is not does not serve the common good, that simply exploits their desperation, is not good, right? So let's turn to a second example: lying and other forms of deception. So the principle here is truthfulness. God is truth, and our faculty of speech is made to communicate with each other what is real. And we owe others the truth according to their legitimate right to it, right? And this is all rooted, obviously, in the dignity of the human person and the nature of language as a gift of communication and a vehicle for communicating truth. A deliberate lie, so choosing as the object of your will to communicate what is false as if it were true, is intrinsically evil. The object perverts the very purpose of speech, which is to communicate truthfulness. And now the physical act of speaking right is good ontologically, but the choice to pervert one's speech, to tell a lie, lacks that due ordering toward truth. It's a privation in the moral order. That's why the Catechism of the Catholic Church and John Paul II's Veritatis Splendor list it among acts that are wrong, regardless of our intention or circumstances. So we may not choose to lie. The object is bent toward a disordered end, and no good intention can straighten it. But this is where the distinction between lying and deception, and the prudential judgment between sharing information that you have an obligation to share and that which you don't, that's where prudence comes in. So not every form of deception is necessarily a lie. If a soldier puts on a camouflage outfit to look like the trees, is he lying that he's a tree? If a military commander uses a feint, F-E-I-N-T, right, where he moves some forces over here to get the enemy to believe that, to shift their forces or whatever, Is that a lie, or is it just tactical? For that matter, what about a quarterback in a football game, right? Who fakes a pass, right? Makes a move like he's passing, or makes a move like he's going to do a handoff and actually throws the other direction or whatever, right? Before D-Day in World War II, Eisenhower, they had all these giant inflatable tanks that they had put at different parts of England to make the Hitler and the Nazis think that the invasion was coming from a different direction. All of that falls under the rules of just war and sports. They're not an example of perverting speech. They're strategies. So remember, some of you remember Anne Frank, right? The Diary of Anne Frank, where she hid in the attic in the Netherlands from the Nazis, who were going to haul away the Jews to concentration camps. So the old example is you're a Dutch person, you're a Christian, Catholic or whatever, and you've got Jews hiding in your attic. And one day the Nazi stormtroopers come and bang on your door and demand, "Are there any Jews here?" Now, if you give a direct lie, "No, there are no Jews here at all," the object of your act is to communicate falsehood and truth. And even though you have a good reason to do that and your intentions are good, it doesn't change the fact that the object is intrinsically disordered. It's a turning of speech from that which is true to that which is false. But many traditional moral theologians, including like St. Alphonsus Liguori and others, have held that you can use sort of mental reservation. You can mentally reserve the fact that you're not going to share all the information with the Nazis that they would like to have. This gets kind of subtle, and it's the kind of thing you examine in the confessional. But there's a qualification that you understand that there are mental reservations. The object is not to pervert speech, but to protect an innocent life by withholding all of the details from the aggressor. Spies in wartime will use a false identity. The object here is strategic deception through actions or reserved speech, not the intrinsic evil of lying. I remember when I was in seminary, a Calvinist seminary, with a lot of very strict Calvinist classmates or classmates who've been raised in very strict Calvinist homes. And I remember we were talking about this exact subject in class one day. And one of the other guys in the school said he was raised in this Calvinist home where his parents, when they left the house to go out for the evening, would not leave a light on in the house, right? So all of us, if you're going to go out for the night, maybe you leave a light on in the house to kind of make the burglars think somebody's still there so they won't, rob your house. Well, his parents said that leaving a light on when they weren't home would be lying to the burglars by telling them that someone was home when they really weren't. See, but in Catholic moral reasoning, I'm not sure that's a lie. The object of leaving the light on is prudent security, not to deliberately communicate false information with your speech. So no one is deliberately perverting speech. Prudence is going to guide us in these edge cases. And I think it's always important to consult our confessor, our priest, helping us to understand whether the actions we're taking are directed towards a good object or a perverse object. There's no development of doctrine that makes lying morally admissible. I think what we understand is that there is clarity, or clarity can emerge about what counts as a true lie versus evasion or strategic deception to protect innocent life or property. So again, the object is what determines the moral species, and the privation is in choosing to pervert the good faculty of speech. So that's a tough one. And if you're like most of us, there's going to be times when you go to the confessional and you talk about maybe times when you weren't entirely truthful, and you have your priest help sort that out. I literally could not do this without you, because this show is 100% listener supported. There are no ads, no sponsors. So if the episodes are helping you to understand the faith, to answer your questions, or draw you closer to historic Catholic Christianity, would you consider becoming a patron? For as little as $5 a month, you'll get every regular episode organized into topical playlists, plus exclusive bonus content, extra conversations, video Q&As, deep dives, live streams, behind the scenes, and more. Just head to patreon.com/considering Catholicism or tap the link in the show notes. Together, we're educating, equipping, and exciting people about the beauty of the Catholic faith. Now let's turn to a third example that I think has really changed over time, and that's corporal punishment of children, or in other words, spanking your kids. Look, the foundational principle is clear from the Catechism and Scripture. Parents have both the right and the serious duty to educate and discipline their children for their genuine good and formation in virtue. Love sometimes requires correction. And this flows from the universal principle of the family as the domestic church, and the parents' role as the primary educators of their children in faith and virtue. Has the Catholic Church ever taught that all corporal punishment is intrinsically evil? No, it has never taught that. Mild, measured, loving discipline of this kind has never been placed in the intrinsically evil category. The object of the action, proportionate correction aimed at educating the child towards their own true good, is not an inherently disordered object. The physical act of correction is good, it's ordered towards the child's formation in virtue. It becomes evil if the object shifts from educating the child to harming the child or vengeance upon the child, which would be a privation of the due good of love and justice. I think this is almost entirely a matter of prudential judgment. A faithful Catholic parent can prudentially decide that spanking their kid is the best form of correction for a particular child at a particular age, in a particular situation and circumstance, for a particular offense. If it's done calmly, proportionately, always with the intention of forming virtue in the child. Another equally faithful parent can prudentially decide that other methods like timeouts or natural consequences or whatever work better for their child at this time and in this place in their home. And I think both of those decisions can be morally good as long as the object remains ordered towards the child's genuine good and never crosses into abuse. Prudence weighs the child's temperament, the cultural context, modern insights into child psychology, the overall family situation. But the object of the act, loving discipline, stays rightly ordered. Our deeper awareness of the dignity and vulnerability of children has made us more cautious. But the Church has not declared that all corporal punishment is intrinsically evil or categorically inadmissible. It does remain within the realm of prudential parental authority, exercised with love and temperance. So the object remains ordered to the child's good. The application is refined by prudence and a deeper grasp of dignity. And this is the kind of organic development that Cardinal Newman, now a doctor of the Church, described. Growth that preserves the principle while applying it more fully in the light of new insights and circumstances. Finally, last example I want to touch is gambling. The Catechism says very directly in paragraph 2413 that games of chance, wagers, and lotteries are, quote, not in themselves contrary to justice. In other words, gambling is not intrinsically evil. The object of placing a bet or buying a lottery ticket on an uncertain outcome is a morally neutral thing. The physical act of risking a stake, putting a buck into the pool, or a quarter into the slot, or $5 to buy your lottery ticket, or whatever it is. I don't know. I've never bought a lottery ticket, but whatever that is, right? That's not in and of itself a bad thing. It's the circumstances and intention that can disorder it. So the privation of the good happens only when the object or the circumstances turn it towards exploitation or addiction or irresponsibility. Because our positive obligation here is stewardship of the gifts and resources God has given us. God has entrusted us with money to provide for our families, to be generous, to build up the common good. And we're also called to the virtue of temperance, so self-control, keeping our passions in check, right? Where does the moral weight fall here? I mean, I think it almost entirely on prudential judgment when it comes to gambling. Is the amount of money and time that you spend on your college basketball pool or whatever it is that reasonable? Are you neglecting duties to your family or work? Is anyone being exploited? Are you at risk of addiction? The $5 bet with friends in the office pool is one thing. Driving to the casino and losing the grocery money or the rent, chasing losses is something entirely different. So prudence requires us to weigh the facts and the consequences for ourselves and for our society. I'm really trying to moderate what I say here because, look, I am a very sinful person. I go to confession. I have long lists of sins and things that I'm prone to. Of all of the sins of which I am prone to, I have never been tempted to gamble. I used to go to Las Vegas on business to technology conventions and such, and I've been there many, many, many times. I've never gambled at the tables in Las Vegas. It just has I don't have any interest. I've never bought a lottery ticket. I've never done a football pool. That doesn't mean because I'm this hugely virtuous person. I mean, I can list other sins that I'm inclined to, but that's not one of them. But I just think this is so pernicious in our society, especially when it's government endorsed. Because we talk about government-sponsored gambling. So, we have the lotteries, state lotteries, sports betting apps. The government used to be against casinos, and it used to be against sports betting when it was the mafia running it. But now every state's the government's all in favor of DraftKings and every other kind of sports betting app on your phone, and casinos everywhere, and state lotteries, because they're making money on it. The government's taxing all of that. So, I think this is a place where faithful Catholics can have legitimate prudential disagreements. Some see it as a voluntary tax. If you don't want to see your money go to the government, through the lottery or through the casino or through, the sports betting apps on your phone, then just don't use them, right? It funds public services. It doesn't force anyone. Others, and I tend to personally be on this side of the fence, see this as a regressive tax on the poor. Because I think when you look at the data, the people who actually lose the most are the people who can't afford it. You don't see a lot of millionaires buying lottery tickets. Go to your casino and look at the people who are sitting there all night playing slot machines. It's not James Bond playing Baccarat, in Monte Carlo or something like that. It's people who clearly don't have the money to lose. All right. And when you look at a lot of the sports betting on people's phones, and the betting apps, I have a suspicion that a lot of that is people who can't afford to lose the money. And it starts to look like the government preying on human weakness for profit. You know, the principles of the common good and preferential option for the vulnerable, I think, should push us to ask hard questions about whether the object of government policy is genuinely ordered to human flourishing, or something that is disordered to create a permanent underclass of poor people that are just trapped in debt cycles. Again, I guess I can say anything I want because it's my show, but that's how I feel about the legalization of marijuana and government gambling, which is that, again, it's not millionaires and billionaires and everything else that traps. It traps a sort of kind of person who really can't afford to spend hundreds of dollars on weed, vape cartridges, and lottery tickets and casino trips. And what we're doing is just the government endorsing trapping people in those kinds of endless debt cycles and creating permanent underclasses. So again, you know, what the Catholic Church is saying here, right, in our moral reasoning is that, you know, a friendly wager in and of itself is maybe morally neutral, but what's the object here? And if the object of the government is to exploit the poor, that's a disordered object. I think in recent decades, there's been some pastoral sharpening here. I think there's more data on gambling addictions, the aggressive marketing by governments. And I think more people in the church are becoming skeptical of legalized gambling. They're seeing the exploitation that's involved in state-promoted gambling is effectively inadmissible in practice, even though the activity itself is not intrinsically evil. So the object of the act remains neutral. Again, you know, betting your friend $5 who's going to win, you know, March Madness is one thing. But the circumstances and societal effects are making the practice prudentially wrong in many contexts. And I think this is prudential judgment at work, applying the unchanging principles to the actual facts on the ground of modern life. Anyway, when you step back and look at these four very different areas of life, so money lending, truth-telling, disciplining kids, gambling, you start to see, I think, the beauty and the wisdom and how the church thinks about moral things. She gives firm absolutes where they're needed, rooted in the objective disorder of certain objects. She calls us to serious positive obligations. She trusts us as mature Christians to exercise prudence in the vast middle ground of life. And she allows her understanding of moral cases to deepen over time without ever selling out the truths that Christ gave us. And as I said in the first episode, this is the precision that drew so many of us into Catholicism. We have clear absolutes where they're needed. We trust prudence when we don't have clear absolutes. We have a living tradition that deepens without reversing. And all of that, I think, frees us to love God and our neighbor with more clear minds and warm hearts. And it helps us to, I think, form our consciences honestly rather than just, picking sides on issues. And it equips us to engage the really difficult questions of our day with something that the world desperately needs right now, which is truth and charity. So anyway, thanks for journeying with me through this little 3-part series. I hope it's given you a fresh appreciation for the remarkable gift of Catholic moral teaching. And if any of this has clicked with you, then I invite you to keep exploring the richness of the Catholic faith. The Church has been thinking about these things for 2,000 years, and she has a place for you in the conversation. So whether you're a curious investigator of Catholicism or a Catholic that's rediscovering your own tradition, I'll see you next time. We'll be back with another episode very soon. And this show is 100% listener supported. My patrons keep the lights on, and they let me spend more time researching and recording so that these episodes keep coming. If this show has helped you, would you consider becoming a patron?
For as little as $5 a month, you'll get every regular episode organized into topical playlists, plus exclusive bonus content, extra video Q&As, deep dive courses, live streams, and more. Just head to patreon.com/considering Catholicism or tap the link in the show notes. And would you please rate the podcast on whatever platform you're using and write a review on Apple Podcasts or on consideringcatholicism.com. And you can drop me a line. Patrons can comment directly on Patreon posts or Spotify. I read every one. Or you can always use the contact form at consideringcatholicism.com, or you can email me at consideringcatholicism@gmail.com. I love hearing your questions, your comments, and your stories.